Sorry in advance for the long post. I'll be calling myself Sarah, and I work at a hospital in upstate New York as a nurse. I was originally from Pennsylvania, but just recently moved towards the Big Apple for a change of pace and scenery. I love doing my job because I genuinely love helping people, but some things started happening here recently that have made me rethink my plans of staying here. There are tons of stories at the hospital I work at. There's one story of a man who was admitted one evening because he collapsed at his construction job. When a doctor came to examine him, he told the man that he would have to stay a while to run some tests. Well, time passed and he had gotten much worse. He could barely breathe and he was in immense pain. When the results finally came back, they had told the man that he had asbestosis, a condition that scars the lungs from breathing in asbestos fibers from his work. Unfortunately, that was not uncommon back then. The man didn't take the news very well. He was in pain and he didn't want to allow the disease to eat away at him any longer. It was later that night when he walked towards his door and looked to see if the hallways were empty. There was an eerie silence around him and no other signs of life in his vicinity. The man proceeded to get on his knees and place his neck on the doorframe. Using all of his strength, the man proceeded to slam the wooden door onto his neck over and over and over. Slam, slam, slam. Crack. It wasn't instant, and the man was in a crazed stupor as he continuously slammed the door onto his neck. Blood splattered everywhere as the sound of flesh tearing and bones breaking filled the hallways. His labored breaths began to gurgle as his throat began to fill with crimson. A short time later, some nurses had found his mess of a body and their screams carried into the night. Apparently, that floor isn't used anymore and you can still hear the door slam. I've been there and done that. I get it. It's fun to scare the newbies when they arrive, especially the ones on night shift. I'm sure this place has some history, but I doubted the existence of the supernatural wonder in the hospital. At first, when they told me about the ghosts, I chuckled and brushed it off, but when my CNO, or Chief Nursing Officer, insisted for me to be careful my first night, I thought I'd pretend to take it a bit more seriously. I ended up going weeks without experiencing a single thing aside from the normal crazy of just working in a hospital, especially during COVID. With the massive influx of patients following the pandemic, we had to clean up and open up every room that we had, even the previously mentioned unused floor. It was one night I was going through the halls and I had to investigate a noise. It was a weekend during the absolute craziness of the pandemic, and we were all being spread thin. We all had to go to areas where we usually wouldn't go, but it was okay. We were all focused on getting these patients situated. I was taking care of an area that didn't have any COVID patients. This was the floor we recently opened up. We had a patient who I'll call Jack, an older gentleman who was brought in because he had some chest pains. I came into Jack's room one night and he asked me if I could give him anything to help him sleep. When he first came in a few days ago, he was extremely bright and chipper despite his condition, but tonight he was pale and shaking. That concerned me, and I asked him if his chest pains were keeping him up at night, and he just looked at me with small tears forming in the corner of his eyes. He shuddered as he told me that someone keeps coming into his room at night. This was my first time hearing about anything like this, so I asked if he could tell me more. Jack downcast his eyes as he began to rub his shaking hands together. He told me that late at night, he would hear his door open and slam shut. He would wake up and see a dark figure crawling towards him. I asked if it was another nurse that we had, but Jack was sure it wasn't them. Jack described the figure as a large man with short white hair. His mouth was open and he said that blood was slowly trickling out of it. He began to shiver a bit as he continued to describe what he saw. Jack continued by telling me that the man was in an old hospital gown, but it was worn with splatters of blood on it. He began to close his eyes as he told me the man's neck was crooked and broken. The flesh on the neck was torn open to reveal shattered bone. I felt sorry for the man. I assumed that he had more issues than just chest pains, so I assured him that I would get someone to check off something that would help him. I had to make my rounds to check on other patients, but I told him I would check on him again soon. As I closed the door to his room, I could hear him quickly shuffle back onto his bed. I made my way around the hall towards the other patients. They all complained about losing sleep, not from a man visiting them at night, but the sound of a door slamming in the hallway. I talked to some other nurses about it, and their faces were in absolute shock. They didn't want to listen to any more and told me I shouldn't be trying to scare them. After forcing down a can of Red Bull and a cup of coffee, I looked at my watch. It was around 3 a.m., so I wanted to go and check on the patients. I walked towards the elevator and pressed the button to go up towards the old floor. I forced a laugh as I remembered Jack's account of the man he saw, one of the old stories about the man who killed himself, and a few other tales the nurses had told me. I didn't want to scare myself, but the description of the figure and the fear I saw in Jack's eyes, that very fear began to slowly sink into me. The elevator doors slowly creaked open and I was met with a dimly lit hallway. We had to save on power, so late at night we wouldn't have all the lights on. As I walked towards the hall, the lights began to flicker. The fluorescent lamps began to buzz as my footsteps slowly echoed through the hallway. I saw something at the end of the hall from one of the rooms, Jack's room. Something was peering at me from the bottom of the doorway. Only the top of their head was visible, but I was able to make out a thin tuft of white hair atop a man's head. As the lights flicked, the flashes of light hit their face and I could see their eyes glow white. I could hear my breath begin to shudder as I stared towards the head, and I could hear another breath. It sounded as if someone was taking short breaths while submerged in water. The quick inhales were low, and I could hear something snap with each labored breath. I jumped as a sudden slam erupted from their direction, and suddenly another, and another. The sound of a door slamming began to echo throughout the hallway, and each time it slammed I could hear something squish, something snap, something tear. I wanted to let out a scream, but nothing would come out. Was I having some kind of waking nightmare? Hallucination? Has my mind conjured some sort of phantom from all those stories? Before I was able to let out my own, a yell could be heard down the hall from Jack's room. His cry of terror made my blood run cold as ice. Then another scream, and another, all coming from the other patients' rooms. The sound came rushing towards me, a dark symphony of horrified cries resonating into my skull. My legs shook, and I fell onto my knees trying desperately to mute the sound by covering my ears. My head was ringing, and I felt blood running down my nostrils. Tears began to flood my eyes, and when I screamed, I couldn't hear anything at all. I was completely drowned in screams. I looked forward, and I saw the head slowly move out of the doorway. When it fully emerged from Jack's room, I could see that it was indeed in an old hospital gown. It was on the floor, propping itself up on its legs and arms. Each limb was bending in an inhuman way, like the legs of a spider, the way the joints shot up and bent downwards. The figure's head was bent, broken, and it swayed back and forth as its eyes flashed white from the flickering of the lights. Each time its neck swayed, it splattered dark red blood onto the walls. It was looking towards me with its mouth slack-jawed. Despite being surrounded by screams, I could faintly hear its blood-soaked inhales. It just stared at me, and I began to slowly shuffle backwards towards the elevator doors. That's when it began to step towards me, and each time it got closer, the dimming lights behind it would pop and shatter. It crept towards me, slowly, while the darkness followed behind it. I was sure I was in hell at this point as the screams got louder, the figure creeping closer, and the darkness covering the hallway. It was only a few feet away from me now. Its limbs groaned and cracked as it moved closer and closer. I'll never forget how its white eyes stayed fixed upon me as its broken neck swayed back and forth, with its jaw hanging down to reveal a small flow of blood. My back was completely on the elevator door, and it was so close to me. It began to scramble over me. Its bent, spider-like arms were on either side of me, and it pushed its face closer to mine. All I could see was its rotten pale face, and behind it, a dark abyss. I couldn't hear anything anymore. The screams must have deafened me. But I pushed my head into the elevator door and closed my eyes tightly as it got even closer. I could feel a cold breath brush my cheeks. I suddenly fell backwards, and my head fell onto the floor of the elevator. I looked up to see another nurse, May, looking down at me confused. She saw that I was white as a sheet and quickly got down to examine me. Blood was trickling out of my nose and ears, and tears were gushing out of my eyes. I could barely speak. All that came out were cries. I looked towards the hallway and it was dimly lit with all of the doors closed. May rushed me out of there and had a doctor go out of his way to look at me. I had to take a week off of work. I was a complete mess, and when I finally recovered, I vowed to not speak of it again. Out of sight, out of mind. I never saw that figure again. There's whispers, of course, from the staff saying that I saw a ghost. I'm just too afraid to admit to what I saw. What scares me the most is that it was just one story. There are many, many more that are echoing through this hospital, and I'm terrified to see the worst of them. I'd like to note that this isn't a fake story, so the past week has been an interesting one. I'm located in Southwest Ohio, and we've had arguably the most confusing events unfold recently. On Friday, October 22nd, our chicken coop, which is a 12-foot by 14-foot structure we paid a lot of money for, had the entire roof caved in with bolts broken clean off hinges and thick 2x4s snapped clean in half. All 13 of our chickens were killed, with 5 missing, 4 chewed to bits, and 4 killed but uneaten. That same night, our neighbor's large mastiff that was almost 7 years old was torn to shreds. We called the game warden upon hearing this, but apparently they can't technically issue any public notice until an animal is physically seen and or captured on video or photo. Saturday, October 23rd, and the farm about a quarter mile up the road from us had all 16 of their goats killed, with only 2 being fully eaten and the others only killed. The game warden shows back up and states that whatever is doing this is what's classified as a sport predator, which means it simply kills to kill. Only thing is, there's no sport predators in Ohio, and only 3 known species in America that are far too small to kill herds of animals and nearly tear a mastiff in half. This morning, Monday, October 25th, half a deer was found in the graveyard near us, with 2 others being found scattered through the woods behind us that some farmers found while looking for some missing sheep. Could be related, could not be related. I'm unclear of the sheep's status in this. Once again, the game warden returned and finally notified all the houses within a 3-mile radius that an unknown predator is in the area. Here's the spookiest part of all. This afternoon, the game warden went to my father and neighbor and told both of them that any trail cam footage they find that may lead to what this thing may be is to be reported directly to authorities and not posted anywhere online or shared with others. I'll keep this updated if any more attacks happen. We'll pray they won't, but be prepared if they do. I woke up to the sound of scratching in my house. This wasn't uncommon. The house I lived in was just a tad out of my price range. It was very nice and in a well-mannered little neighborhood. I proposed the idea of sharing the house with my friend so that we could have the chance to live in something more than just a nice apartment. We're both single and have never had any kids, so the money we made just went to bills and necessities. Everything else was extra. We had some things in common, like being total nerds and playing video games more than we should, but as far as sleep schedules, we couldn't be more opposite. He was one of those perky morning run types who got out early and did all his business. I, on the other hand, was the sleep until 10 kind of guy who needed coffee and for people to leave me alone until I woke up. Anyway, the only compromise we had to make as roommates was the situation with Jeffrey's dog, Jax. Jax is a huge German Shepherd and is friendly enough, but he sheds like crazy. I am super allergic to dogs and cats, along with pretty much anything that sheds fur, so I told Jeffrey that he could bring Jax as long as he stayed on his own downstairs. Now, that might sound like terrible pet ownership, but it was far from Jack's own little prison. This dog lived better than we did sometimes. The way our house is set up is that it's seated on a hill. The top floor, where mine and Jeffrey's bedrooms, the kitchen, dining room, storage and laundry room, and living room were, set on the top of the hill, and if we walked out of the front door, we could see the front yard and the road. The basement door, led to the bottom of the house, which set toward the bottom of the hill. This was more or less meant to be a den or an entertainment room of some sort, but Jeffrey had turned it into a doggy paradise. It had a door that led out into our fenced-in backyard that Jax could roam freely back and forth between using the dog door that we installed. This ensured my allergy problem would stay confined to the bottom of the house, but every now and again when Jeffrey was gone, I'd get reminders that Jax was there. I'd hear him whimpering because his auto-feeding machine was clogged, or, maybe out of pure clumsiness, he knocked his water bowl over and needed a refill. Sometimes he would walk up the stairs and start scratching at the door. Now, I don't hate animals, and I'm not some kind of a prick, but my allergies are wicked bad. I'll sneeze continuously for hours, and my eyes swell up and get puffy along with my nose stopping up like a dam. So I would sometimes help out Jax and then instantly regret it. I was getting to the point where I was getting legitimately angry at Jeffrey for not having Jax set up to be automatically taken care of when he was gone. I understand that dogs are like big children, and most of them will always find a way to need your attention, and not everything will be perfect, but I can't handle the consequences of interacting with them. This brings us back to the beginning. I woke up this morning and looked at my clock. 10 a.m. it said in bright red numbers. As I said, I woke up to the sound of scratching at the door to the basement. It took me a while to get up, but I finally did. After a few failed attempts at yelling down the hall to tell Jax to calm down and that it would be okay, I decided I would take a shower and let him tire himself out. I got my cup of coffee, smoked a good cigarette, and then took a nice hot shower. When I got out, I couldn't hear the scratching anymore. I had figured he'd gotten tired and given up. After a quick sigh of relief, I went on with the rest of my day. It wasn't until about 3 p.m. that I heard the scratching again. This time, it was a little slower. I half expected to hear a sad little whimper from behind the door, but I didn't. Now that I think about it, I didn't hear him whimpering earlier either. I brushed it off and tried to ignore it. There was no way that dog wasn't fully set up and taken care of. Not after the scolding I gave Jeffrey last week. Jeffrey had got this crazy new food and water system set up that could sustain Jax for like 3 days straight, so I knew Jax was fine. It was just annoying at this point. I heard it again at around 4:30 p.m. and then again at 6 p.m. Every time it came back, it sounded weirder and harder. It's hard to explain, but it's like Jax was slowly scratching just to let me know he was there, like some sort of creepy stalker or something. 6:30 p.m. rolls around and the scratching had stopped. Shortly after, I hear Jeffrey's car pull up and the door shut. Finally, I think to myself as I see his shadow strolling up to and past the window. The door clicked with the rotation of his keys and it slowly came open. "I'm so glad you're home. We need to talk, man," I said as he entered the doorway. "Okay, hold on," Jeffrey said, as he looked back out of the door, putting his hand up to his mouth like he was about to yell for somebody. "Come on, Jax. Come on, boy. Let's go inside." My heart dropped. Confused, and quite frankly scared, I tried to correct Jeffrey. "Dude, he's in here. He's been scratching at this door all day." "What are you talking about, man? Jax has been with me all day. I took him to get checked up at the vet and to get groomed, then we went shopping at the pet store. Are you okay, mate?" he said as calmly as could be. I was about to call him a liar and correct him again, and that's when I saw Jax come strolling by his legs, tail wagging and looking freshly groomed, walking directly to the basement door like a good boy. "What the hell is in our basement, Jeffrey?" I said frantically as I got off the couch and began to stare intently at the door. "What are you going on about, Adam?" Jeffrey said, confused. "There has been something scratching at the inside of that basement door all day. What the hell is in our basement?" "Adam, dude, I think you've been playing a little too much of that scary game, man. Nothing can get in or out of there except Jax. And with the tight security in this fancy neighborhood, I highly doubt it's a person. Maybe you've been hearing something that sounds like scratching and your mind is just playing tricks on you," Jeffrey said as he walked to the basement door. "Here, I'll show you." My heart sank into my stomach as he reached the door, and before I could tell him to stop, he opened it. To my surprise, there was nothing there. It was the door that caught our attention, however. Both of us looked in speechless astonishment as we saw the large claw marks on the door's backside. They looked as if they had been etched in by the talons of a large eagle. They were deep and long, with 5 of them parallel to show whatever had made these scratch marks had had hands like a human, but much larger. There was also a slimy substance on the door and on the stairs, leading all the way out of the dog door. Jeffrey, being much braver than I am, called animal control and gave them a description of what we saw while also investigating Jack's room and the backyard. He had discovered that the slimy trail led up and over the fence and into the little wooded area beyond the fence. He didn't go past the fence, and animal control never came out. Some men in suits, however, came by and asked us a few questions, which we found odd, and then gave us another place to stay while they investigated the house. Soon after, we moved, and Jeffrey and I found separate housings. I don't know what was scratching on the door that day, but I don't think I'd want to know what would have happened if I opened it. This all happened back when I worked as an emergency department nurse at the hospital in my hometown. We saw a lot of sad cases there, a lot of horrible things, but this incident stuck with me for different reasons. I saw what's on the other side that night. It was a Friday and a full moon on top of that. Just ask any nurse what that means and they'll tell you it's not a myth but a real fact of the job. People get weird on full moons, and Friday nights usually mean a lot of drunks and ODs. A lot of car accidents, too. Sure enough, just as we were getting ready to go for break, a head-on collision rolled in. 2 passengers, 1 driver. Another EMS was on the way with the driver from the other car, the sole occupant of that vehicle, reeking of alcohol. Straight from the back of the ambulance, they came to us. It was a mother and a father, as well as their young daughter, only 10 years old. I won't get into specifics, but they were all in bad shape. Intubation, blood products, fluids, epinephrine, CPR. We eventually got them all somewhat stabilized. We had a small window of time where we could take our shortened breaks, since we were short-staffed and overcrowded. All the nurses were starving and exhausted, so we buddied up and went off to rest for a little while. I was getting the impression that the family would survive, but they still needed to be monitored very closely. I told my coworker Sarah to wake me up if anything happened or if they needed help. After working an extended shift the day before, I was exhausted and needed to take a short nap. It wasn't against any policies and was regular practice, so don't accuse me of slacking off because of what happened next. None of us could have predicted it. After wheeling a stretcher into a storage room, I turned off the lights and quickly fell asleep, a blanket from the warming cabinet wrapped snugly around me. My dreams were terrible. I kept feeling like someone was standing over me, watching me while I slept, talking quietly in a young girl's voice. She was calling out, "Mommy? Mommy, where are you? Mommy? Mommy? Where are you, Mommy?" The piercing scream woke me up from my slumber, and I sat bolt upright on the stretcher in the darkened room. There was something in there with me. She was standing between me and the light switch. Part of me knew right away, but still, I had to see for myself. My heart thumping in my jugular and in my chest, beating heavy against my ribs, I reached for my phone. I had set it down on a shelf and couldn't find it. Patting the area, my fingers brushed against it and I grabbed hold of it, almost dropping it in the process. The person was quiet now, and I could almost have convinced myself it was just a nightmare, if not for the sounds of their shuffling feet, their rapid, frustrated breathing. With a shaking finger, I unlocked the phone and turned on the flashlight app, illuminating the space in front of me. The little girl was standing there staring at me. She had her hands at her sides, and I noticed her bottom lip was quivering with despair. Her pale face was looking at me as if pleading for help. That was what my mind registered for a split second, but then it was gone, vanished like the smoke from a blown-out candle flame. I couldn't sleep after that. There was just no possible way. My entire body was trembling, and I ran out of that room and straight back to the nurse's station, thinking maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe we could still save her. All I needed to do was look at the faces of my coworkers to know what had happened. The little girl had passed away. Their eyes were all full of tears, and Sarah walked over to me and gave me a hug. "I'm sorry. She went so fast," was all she said, and I knew exactly who she was talking about. "I just saw her," I told them. "She was in the storage room. She asked me where her mommy was." Sarah and my other coworkers dropped their jaws at that. They could see by the look on my face I was serious, and on top of that, I had already known she was dead before they told me. An hour or so later, despite all that had happened, Sarah had to go take a short rest. Some nights we don't even get that opportunity, winding up going home exhausted and malnourished, dehydrated and hypoglycemic, our feet sore and our heads aching after a day of working without stopping. These days, that happens more often than I'd like to admit. I was tasked with looking after her patient while she went to go eat something. One of her patients was the drunk driver who had killed the little girl and severely injured her parents. He was sleeping soundly, still drunkenly oblivious to what he had done. After Sarah left, I began doing some documentation on the computer. It was a little after 3 a.m. by that point, and that's about the time when bad things seem to happen, especially on Friday nights with full moons when you're working in the hospital. Surely enough, I began to hear a sound coming from inside the patient's room. It sounded like a voice talking. A little girl, I realized as I got closer. Surely enough, I began to hear a sound coming from inside the patient's room. It sounded like a voice talking. A little girl, I realized as I got closer. My feet were stepping forward of their own account at that point. I seemed to have no control as they carried me into the room, and I stood there in the doorway, looking at the man in bed. The little girl stood near the window, pointing at him. She cast no reflection in the glass behind her. On the other side of the bed, closest to me, there was a large shadow, its edges ill-defined, but vaguely humanoid, seeming to move and gust in the air currents, and then hovering over the man's face. "That's him," said the little girl, pointing at the man in bed. "He's the one who took my mommy from me." The shadow cloud suddenly descended, covering the man's face like a pitch-black swarm of bees, like a sentient fog made of darkness. Where his eyes had been a second before, now I could only see a shadowy blur. The man's legs began to jerk. His feet began to kick. His arms flew up and down, and I called for help just as the fog around his face disappeared, and with it, the little girl. They both turned into nothing, ascending through the ceiling tiles, vanishing from my sight. We lost 2 patients that night. One of them we were heartbroken over. The other one disturbed us, me in particular, for other reasons. I couldn't help but think of the people I have wronged over the years, the patients we couldn't save, the little girl especially. Part of me can't help but picture her standing over me, pointing at me while I lay asleep in bed, a shadow entity hovering above me, deliberating. I imagine her pointing at me and saying, "Him, that's the one who let me die."